Hey, everybody. This is a lecture on primary and secondary sources. I'm going to make this a real brief lecture because I think you've already probably covered much of this information. But just to make sure you've got it. And also, there are a couple of things that a lot of students will sometimes get a little bit tripped up on or struggle with. So I just want to cover those. So this can be a real brief lecture. You can always go back through this PowerPoint anytime you need. So when we're talking about primary and secondary sources are those documents or objects that were created during the time period studied. Okay? They offer an inside view of an event and are generally created by someone who experienced or witnessed the event, but not always. If it was created around the time of the event, it is considered a primary source. A lot of students will oftentimes mess up on this and think that a primary source has to be created by someone who witnessed the event, but that is not the case. So a newspaper or a television news broadcast, even though the people telling you the news or writing the article might not have been at the event themselves, because it was created during the time period, it is considered a primary source. So examples of primary sources include journals and letters, news articles, and you can read the rest of the list there. There are some advantages of primary sources when you're studying history. It does offer an immediate picture of the events. It oftentimes reveals information that's not found elsewhere, especially if you're looking at diaries or letters. Um, it does not interpret the evidence after the fact, and it aids in the discovery of truth about a person, event, issue, etc. And it just gives you a really authentic view of what people thought or um, kind of the culture or just some real personal stuff is usually given to you by a primary source. And that brings us to, disadvantages of primary sources first is sometimes they can be difficult to read or interpret. They are representative of one point in time with no explanation of preceding or following events, typically. They tend to be very biased because they're from one person's point of view, and emotional because of the limited perspective. They're not always designed to inform either, and so they're written for different purposes. Um, so primary sources can be difficult at times and can be misinterpreted often as well. Secondary sources, then. Information that was created later by someone who did not experience the event firsthand or participate in the event. And so they're from a different time period. They often interpret or analyze many primary sources, and they may include elements of primary sources such as quotes or photographs, etc. So within a secondary source, you might get elements of a primary source because usually that secondary source is evaluating the event based on multiple primary sources. So examples here of secondary sources um, is basically, again, anything you're looking at that was created after the fact. And there are a lot of advantages of secondary sources. A lot of times when I ask students which one is less biased, a lot of times students will pick primary sources, thinking they're less biased because they're like, oh, because the people were at the event, so they know what actually happened. Well, they know what actually happened from their point of view. And that actually makes it a very biased account. Secondary sources are typically less biased. Although there is bias in them, they're able to take a look at an event from multiple perspectives. Now, are they still telling their story and deciding which primary sources to use? And is that biased itself? Yes. Everything is biased in some way. And a secondary source can pretend it's unbiased if they're trying to sway you. So there's some tricks and some things you got to be careful with that people can do with a secondary source. But typically, I would go to a secondary source like an encyclopedia, especially one that really tries to give you all of the primary sources and gives you all the different perspectives that there might be. Um, Disadvantage of secondary source: you're trusting someone else's research to be complete and accurate. May contain bias, which influences your view. So again, bias is in there. Um, Especially if they leave out certain facts or if they're trying to sway you to believe a historical event from a certain point of view. Okay. Um, here's one good thing to look at, or at least talk about real quickly, because a lot of students have heard somewhere that Wikipedia is bad. And so usually we have the discussion, and people are like, well, yeah, you shouldn't use Wikipedia. Well, eh, the question is why? And people usually respond, well, it can be changed. Anybody can change Wikipedia. But here's the deal. First of all, there are monitors who monitor whether people are putting on appropriate stuff or not. And also, if you post something on Wikipedia, you typically have to put whether there's a source or there is some sort of evidence for what you're saying. And the last piece that makes Wikipedia actually reliable is that anybody can change it. And so if somebody puts false information on there and thousands of other people see it, they can just go and say, hey, no, this isn't true. And so it actually makes it, in a way, a very reliable source. So you can use Wikipedia in this class. Now, I wouldn't use it as my final source. If you check out a Wikipedia page, it will often have like the sources at the bottom. And so then that you can go to that to see if the evidence of what is being said is correct or not. But I would definitely use Wikipedia as a starting point and then go to the specific sources that are typically listed at the bottom there. So anyway, that might be news to you and some interesting information. But anyway, what you should do is take a look through this and see if the following sources, if you can go through this quiz here and see if the following sources are primary or secondary, because you're going to be doing this in just a minute. So these should be fairly easy. Primary, 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 secondary, primary, it's an actual speech or an actual photograph. Secondary, it's a biography about John Adams. Primary. So anyway, just in case you didn't get those, you got some quizzes to take on primary and secondary sources. Go through those quickly. Make sure you understand which ones are primary, which ones are secondary. Thanks, everybody.